Good morning, everyone. Am I audible? Yeah, okay. Okay, good morning, everyone, and that was really an interesting presentation, John. So we will start a Q&A session with John for the next 20 minutes. Let me introduce myself. I'm Jayesh, Easwarmony. I lead the ICT practice for Frost & Sullivan for Asia Pacific. So let me start right away. Okay. We all know that the cloud is a journey, right? And you are a visionary, you can see up to 2020. But unfortunately, a lot of us can see only quarter by quarter, right? The next 1 year is where determines our bonus and so on. So if we take a smaller time frame, which is the next 12 to 18 months, what do you see as the intermediate journey to the cloud? What will move to the cloud? What won't? Any thoughts on that?
The one thing that is most evident when you're talking to customers is there are customers like Mr. Miller, who I refer to, who is, as far as I can tell, the furthest along in true implementation of this ideal model for the cloud. And there's other customers who haven't taken a single step. They haven't even virtualized applications in their data center, and they're wondering, is this a problem? There's customers who have implemented things and realized that they can't find the economies that they were promised. In other words, there's kind of they thought that there was going to be good ROI and there's no valid justification. I think the message I give you is there is no structured timeline of what's going to happen. It's going to be different for every customer situation based on the type of applications they run, based on the immediacy of their business, based on the security of the information they have to handle. The coaching I give to CIOs and IT providers is you need to look at the assets in your data center, which represent the biggest cost, and consider each one of them on an application basis. Can I move forward with something that moves me closer to this ideal state and get some economic benefits? And frankly, don't go implementing something if there's not a clear business value proposition for it.
And do CIOs acknowledge that the end state, which whether you call it public cloud or what I would call IT as a service, is that acknowledged as an end state now?
I think it's disagreed upon a lot. I don't think everybody either conceives of that same endpoint or necessarily accepts it. Some people who are kind of defeatists say, we'll never get there. But, I was a manufacturing engineer in 1980 when the first talk of outsourcing to offshore providers to do manufacturing was discussed. And it was very simple. There's no way they'll ever get the quality and be able to handle the complex manufacturing that we're able to handle. Right? And now you look at it today, and that 30 years later, that whole concept is just laughable, that any company in the world would have the assets of a Foxconn and be able to do the kind of production and high quality, high productivity development. I think the same, when I hear naysayers saying we can never get to that point, I think they just are not understanding the kind of the relentless progress that happens with innovation and changing business models.
And you said that it's not so much about the technology, it's about business model and agility it gives. But is it also because of human psychology where the CIOs face a threat from cloud computing? So how do you see the role of the CIO changing? Do they perceive cloud as a threat? How does it impact their day-to-day business?
I think they're all over the map too. The ones that you hear most typically are the CIOs that have been dazzled by the hype and believe that their company is not doing what it needs to do if they don't have something that feels like cloud implementation. So I think specifically with pursuing things that are real cloud models, there's a lot of hype and there's a lot of CIOs that are reacting to that. I think at the other end of the scale, the second most common thread I hear is this question about, am I just putting myself out of a job? If I'm the head of the IT department, if I'm the data center manager, do I even have a job in this world where everything's virtualized and outsourced? I think those two kind of diametrically opposed attitudes are the most common ones I hear.
And you spent 2 weeks in this Asia Pacific region, and of course, a lot of people, when they come from the US, they APAC with one region, and it's like 5 to 6 regions. So where do you see hotspots emerging within Asia Pacific? Anything you can share on front country places which are exciting beachheads for cloud computing?
You know, I completely agree with your assessment. Anyone who looks at Asia Pacific any more so than looking at Europe as a homogeneous whole doesn't understand the region at all. The difference between business in China, business in Australia, New Zealand, and India is night and day. That being said, if you look at the World Monetary Fund estimates of growth, Asia Pacific as a region is going to grow 6.6% versus the rest of the world closer to 4.4. So 50% more growth in this region. So as a whole region, this is where I think a lot of the transformation and the money is going to exist. I believe this year alone, $300 billion in IT to fund IT throughout the region from China to India and Australia. The hot countries obviously go to China, India, Korea is very interesting, Japan is very interesting. And Australia, New Zealand, represents an ongoing element of force. Of course, I'd be bereft to leave out Singapore and some of the other places who are traditional technology leaders. So, it's hard to try to go after this region and say, just one spot or just a limited number. There's so many interesting investments going on throughout the region.
And what about some of the emerging markets where the broadband infrastructure is a bottleneck, like Indonesia or Thailand? So, where do you see them? I mean, I agree with you that these countries are the early adopters, but what about emerging markets, especially they are at the stage where they need to make IT investments to ramp up productivity, but at the same time, if they can do it cheaper, it works better for them, but the bottleneck is the investment.
And there's reason to believe that you're going to see some leapfrog behavior, as you did with cellular communication networks in the Southeast Asia region in general, is the fact that they're starting from a blank slate gives them the flexibility to invest very specifically in future technology. If I would look at the steps that needs to happen in those emerging markets, communication infrastructure, there's nothing else you take away from this. It's about the network. It's all about the network. You cannot build these business models unless you can rely on your communication network and it has the quality of service and bandwidth to deliver the business value. The second is distributed IT assets throughout the infrastructure. So the evolution of service providers, to that point, I think is what you're going to see is the most critical keystone to launch the development in the emerging spaces.
We also know that the IT ecosystem has a traditional two-player, three-player kind of model where you have resellers, system integrators, and distributors. So because of the cloud, how do you see the impact of the ecosystem? Do you see that some of these box pushers might be thrown out of business? How do you see the impact of the ecosystem?
This is a very grave concern. I mentioned IT departments worried about them being out of jobs because they run data centers and data centers are going away. I'd say that when I talk to partners, this is number one issue that they have universally and across the board. I think the answer is twofold. First of all, there's going to be a period of refreshing most of the networking infrastructure that's in place today over the next 5, maybe as long as 10 years. So first of all, while this is a trend that everyone needs to look at, the fact of the matter is most people need to build launching pads to the cloud before they get there, and to build a launching pad means that they're going to refresh a lot of their infrastructure. So I believe we're going to see one of the biggest technology build-outs in the last decade occur over the next 5 to 10 years. The second point is, there is a basic rule in business, which is, we're all walking up a down escalator. And if we ever stop walking, we get pushed to the bottom of the escalator. And it's true for service providers and resellers today, is that they need to realize that they can't do the business that they did 5 years ago and expect growth and high margins. They need to move their feet and walk up the escalator, even if they're going to stay in the same place from a business process standpoint. So what each reseller needs to do, and what every member of the value chain needs to look at, is how do I put myself in a higher value position. This is why service providers are going to be provisioning more data centers over the next 5 to 10 years than enterprises are, because they're looking at transformational business models. Resellers have to do the same thing.
Yeah, you talked about an escalator analogy. It's like the African, forest, right? It doesn't matter whether the cheetah or the deer both have to run equally fast, right? So I think that's what we're seeing in the ecosystem, especially, right? And I really doubt that some of the resellers who make 8 to 10% margin are going to be successful in transforming that. And you said service providers. We see them taking. What we've seen is they want to roll out cloud services from an enterprise perspective. But are they also equally utilizing the cloud? I mean, in the sense that do they practice what they preach?
I think so. It's funny. This is not like pushing a rope, if you understand that analogy. Most service providers kind of get it. They've been under siege for the last 5 years because of the concept of free data plans, and increasingly people believe that access to data resources should be a fixed price and you can pump as much data through it as possible. Well, that's killing their economic models, because their need to buy bandwidth and capacity and provision that capacity is continuing to go up, driving their cost models, and yet they're not getting any more revenue for that. So literally over the past 5 years, they've had to start figuring out where the next step is. The escalator is moving really fast for them right now. And so they've had to start running pretty quickly. And most of them, the coin dropped. They figured it out that if they don't become a destination, if they don't become part of who's getting to charge for data services, they're going to be put out of business.
And micro-billing is one of the key capabilities.
Exactly.
So we know that cloud adoption is increasing, and we think at least 23% of the enterprises want to do something with the cloud. But another risk which we see is because there are different architectures, they also fear vendor lock-in, especially when they're implementing private cloud. So how do you see, at an industry level and even at a Brocade level, trying to assuage that problem or the perception?
Yeah, well, the thing I would stress about virtualization is the true power of virtualization is to hide what the underlying hardware is. Right? So you would think you could draw a hard line at the virtualization layer, and any vendor that's trying to tell you that what's below it needs to be a certain set of products configured a certain way, they're going down to get it. Because any customer should be able to look at that and say, wrong answer. I want an open architecture, I want capacity, and I don't want to pay a lot for the nameplate. And so, this really should produce much better efficiency in deploying compute capacity and storage capacity. That being said, above the virtualization layer, though, how do we make sure that once I run an application, once I can run an application in one place, I think we've got a reasonable model that says I don't care whether it's got a Dell or an HP or an IBM nameplate on it, but I have a little more trouble knowing that I'm going to be able to find the same operating environment if I take that application and I move it through the cloud to somebody else's center. And so there is a lot of discussion going on in our industry right now, and I think we recognize that we have to work across the industry to come together and come to an agreement on a way where we can really create this distributed virtualization domain where applications can run where and when the owners want them to based on business reasons, not technical limitations.
But there's also too many standards being created, right? Yesterday IEEE wanted to standardize cloud infrastructure. We also know that European Union wants to do something about it. Are we getting to a stage where there are too many people, too many cooks spoiling the broth?
We've only had a couple of really horrible situations in our industry over the past 30 years where ultimately we could not come down and agree on one standard where there only needed to be one. It seems to be the speciality of the DVD and the CD industries. They always seem to be able to figure out how to make sure there's at least 2 standards. I think we as a networking industry have been much better about, the battles will happen, and then there may be 2 conflicting ones that ultimately emerge. But because this is a fully connected universe, you can't persist with multiple flavors. The companies, the large IT solution providers that in the 80s and 90s tried to drive structured architectures, Token Ring and SNA as an example, failed. They did not ultimately lead the industry or drive networking standards or drive the way we all work together. They became overwhelmed by the proletariat, if you will, and people getting to choose to have flexibility and choose the best economies. And I think the same will happen on the standard side. We may go quite a ways in kind of coming to agreement and vendor-driven camps, but ultimately I think there's going to be the bridge and the smoothing into a unified architecture.
I mean, it's just the vendor that I'm more hopeful, but now you have governments as well trying to enforce standards, even when on an industry by industry basis, like if you want to use the cloud for banking, then there are a set of regulations. So with that, I mean, the fact that the governments are also getting involved in this process is
well, don't confuse regulatory with standard with industry operational standards. To be honest with you, I think everybody here knows the regulatory environment's necessary. I mean, chief security officers, chief information officers, this is stuff that keeps them up at night. And they need to have, and we now in most economies around the world have business operations standards that need to be certified and be auditable. And I think the government can actually add some value in, if you will, a light framework by which those regulations can be defined, can be uniformly applied, and that frankly someone doesn't have to fully audit a supplier, that there's some amount of government support to assure that if somebody says one thing and actually doesn't deliver it, that there is some ability for recompense on that.
One point that always intrigues me is that when you say people will move to the cloud, and you also mentioned people are doing more with less, like the number of servers being used. So ideally, in a cloud-based environment, you can reduce the cost, which inevitably means that this corporate spending on IT will come down or reduce its growth rate. So the question is, how will vendors make money, make profits, if the spending, in a way, you're forcing the industry to spend lesser, right? And if standardization happens, there's not that much switching costs as well, which was responsible for some of the profitability. So how do you make money in this, or how do you continue to grow?
You know, this fear of innovation or this fear of productivity has been around for the 30 years that I've been in the technology sector, and I've worked in several different facets of the technology sector. Each one went through a process where they had some major evolution that fundamentally changed the nature of and the cost of a piece of the infrastructure. One of my best examples would be working at HP back in the early 80s when laser printers used to be bigger than that table, and only the most exotic companies with a data center team to support it could afford it. And over the next 5 to 10 years, the evolution of that technology went to the point where literally everyone could afford it. And instead of it going from a $100,000 machine to a $100 machine, meaning that the market collapsed by 1,000, the market blossomed into billions of customers because suddenly the technology and the capability became affordable. In other words, my experience is that innovation and breakthroughs in productivity drive new business models, which instead drive up consumption, as opposed to ultimately letting the air out of the bag. What tends to die is I guess, old and dated technologies or companies that get fixated on how something is done versus the value of what it is. And as long as people stay focused on the value they provide, these new options and these new ways of getting more efficiency out of business, I think is going to cause new creation of new business models, new enterprises, and frankly, new growth in almost most of the industries that touch the sector.
I have come to the end of my questions. So, how much time do we have? We have time for questions. Yeah. Any questions from the audience?
I probably don't need a microphone.
Just the audience or Okay.
just about data sovereignty, I haven't heard anything. You've talked about outsourcing data, the cloud, all those sort of hot topics. And how many of the CIOs that you've been speaking with are really hearing about data sovereignty, where the data, and particularly the finance data is being stored?
I'm sorry, can you repeat to the end of the question again?
Just in relation to data sovereignty, where the data center is being outsourced to, if it is outside of their country, are the CIOs caring? Are the government departments that are looking at the cloud caring about where the information is stored?
Okay, yeah. So the question was around data sovereignty, and the folks that are out there today who are deploying various solutions, how really flexible are they on the virtualization of the cloud? In other words, do they really care where their information or their applications is being hosted? And the answer is, and that's to me, this is the perceptual gap between what I say and how long this is going to need to play out versus people that I think are kind of pushing the hype, who are dismissing these issues like data sovereignty as being inconsequential and small things. The fact of the matter is, most cloud implementations are in that third box. They are private clouds. In other words, they are structured where the person building this distributed data center with some of their own assets and some of the assets that they procure, they literally are defining both ends. So even if they're in someone else's data center, they know the equipment it's running on, they may have a cage around it, it's very customized, as you would expect in the initial phases. So the number of places where somebody kind of tosses their stuff out there and trusts somebody else to host it wherever is efficient, not many of those, unless the data just doesn't matter. There's a lot of stuff, best effort kind of offerings where you want almost RAID-like capabilities out of the thing, and you're not going to run into government regulations on customer or employee information. But almost anything that is customer, employee, financial, it is locked down, and it is a very private structure, even if it's cloud-based. And probably will be, like I said, until significant regulatory changes occur.
Hi, I'm Uday from India. That was a nice presentation. And there was a passing remark about security concern. So don't you think security is the biggest threat or the biggest threat in concern in the cloud computing industry? There are security concerns at multiple levels of technology and use, for instance, server level, network level. So according to you, how does the industry should address security concerns? Is there a need for certification?
To be honest with you, I believe, so security, as I said, is really the enabler of going from the private cloud to any of the last two boxes in that thing. And how then security is implemented and how much hands-off a customer can be in being able to go out and validate that somebody is a reasonable provisioner. I think in the short term, it's going to be very hands-on. If I go back to my manufacturing analogy, you never would have outsourced to somebody unless you inspected their facilities and you kind of, literally looked at other products, gave them prototypes. And so I think for the next 5 or so years, it's going to be a very customized solution, a very hands-on touch solution. I think the potential for certification, the potential of structures by which you can kind of look at somebody and maybe just from the front curb or the front office, you can get comfortable, a much higher level of comfort that they are going to be sufficient may occur, but I think it's out there. I think it's an area of maturation, and I think it's an enabler to the next phases.
I think we have one panel which is going to discuss security.
Yeah.
So we thought we would not start with that in this session, but I'm sure many questions on security will obviously be there.
Hi, Vidya from Frost & Sullivan. I have the digital media practice globally. My question is from what you said. You said that every service provider wants to become a data center, and every data center wants to be a service provider. So, how disruptive do you think it would be for the overall industry growth? And a connected question is, is the customer of today educated or very well aware of the difference between service providers and technology vendors? Then finally leading to a good purchasing decision around cloud-based IT adoption that he wants to drive.
Okay, what was the first question? I'm sorry.
The way the landscape is changing, where every data center wants to become a service provider, and every service provider wanting to become a data center. Do you consider that could be disruptive or challenging to the overall industry growth in terms of revenues and penetration and adoption rates?
So as I said, I think transformation has demonstrated that the only people who get really hurt by transformation is those who won't accept it. I spent a year working at Nortel and selling off and closing down part of Nortel. Nortel was the largest networking company in the world, one of the largest voice companies in the world, and now they don't exist. Because voice over IP, unified communications fell right into their lap. There was no company that was set up for success better than them, and they failed. Because they truly believed they were strong enough and powerful enough that they could drive the industry to just ignore transformation and just go along merrily. And to me, that's an exceptional icon of what can happen if you don't see transformation as an opportunity. And frankly, the people with the most to lose need to be the leaders of transformation, not the leaders of denial. And there's many examples of folks who did have the most to lose coming out after the end of their transformation as the winners. But it was a belief that they wanted to innovate, they wanted to, if you will, kind of cannibalize their own children faster than anybody else in the industry. Because if that's the rule, is if you don't do it, somebody else will do it to you. With regards to the second question, the service provider ecosystem is quite fascinating now. And if I go back to my analogy of manufacturing, contract manufacturing, what's kind of happened is there's some boutique manufacturers today that do customized and very specialized, and then there's one or two giant mega providers. I don't think the same is going to happen on service provider. Service providers from small regionals are embracing data center deployments, all the way up to the AT&T and Verizons of the world are also looking at this and recognizing this is one of their key service capabilities. So this is fascinating to be an adoption trend, which is going from so-called smallest businesses in the sector to the very largest, and they're moving very uniformly. My belief is the end state, or at least certainly a foreseeable end state, is not going to see the level of consolidation that we did, for instance, in contract manufacturing. One of the reasons is the speed of light. The issue with data sovereignty. The ability to have somebody very close to you that understands your region, understands your end customers and your environment, and provides a very personal relationship versus the big global megas who can provide a unified and distributed architecture around the globe. I think they're complementary, and I think they'll both ultimately participate in the evolution over the next 10 years. Get more than 10 or 15 years out, and I defy anybody to try to figure out what it's going to look like.
All right, we have room for one question.
Yes. Can anybody hear me? Transcribe this.
Tony Chan from Palm State. Just wanted to continue the service provider track here. I know a lot of regional service providers have actually launched cloud services, or they call it cloud. I mean, there's actually no details in terms of the infrastructure they're actually running, what kind of service. But I mean, obviously, most of them are just focused on the SME market, like repackaging SaaS services as cloud. Right? So, what is the risk of actually these people really ruining the market for the actual cloud because they provide the quality of service? I mean, service provider doesn't really have a very good track record launching innovative services. So, what is your opinion?
We actually have a panel, I believe, more or less on this topic as well. But let me give you a real quick kind of high-level point of view. I think what you're going to see is that the large, very large service providers are going to come back with much more packaged and generic capabilities. And in fact, will be many of the hosters for hybrid clouds and for private cloud architectures that are based on consultative engagement. I think the small providers are going to bootstrap themselves. And so, like you said, many of them are saying that they provide these capabilities, and often there's nothing there yet. What a lot of them are doing is kind of marketing and fishing. And the way that they're going to implement their services is they're going to get a customer come to them and say, I really need data center, or I want to take this application which I run in my data center and I want to outsource it to you. And literally they're going to use that specific instance and relationship to begin to build out capabilities. In many cases, they actually acquire the equipment of the small company, and then they start running it for them for a fee, and they kind of get their feet into the water very slowly. So what I've seen in service providers that have limited capital and don't want to just jump in to the water without knowing how deep it is, they kind of take these incremental small steps, and they literally are not going to spend $1 until they actually have a customer for some type of service. And those are the two models I've seen, is where they either sell capacity on demand or they sell, they basically take over applications and become an extender of the base facility, or take the charge of the whole facility.
Okay. So I think when this journey started out, cloud computing was compared to Barack Obama, because both of them created a lot of hype. And we don't know where the other one is going, but thanks to John, we know where cloud computing is going. So with that, I'll end this session, and thank you so much, John, for the answers.
Thank you, Jayesh.